Let's begin with Benedict Anderson's theory of nationalism from imagined communities, where he argues that nations are not natural or eternal, but are rather imagined communities. They're imagined because members of even the largest nation will never meet most of their fellow citizens, yet they still feel a deep bond of connection. This sense of belonging is created through shared culture, communication, and political imagination. For Anderson, nationalism is not just political, it is also a cultural construct. The rise of print capitalism, such as newspapers, novels, and mass literacy, has created shared language spaces and allowed people to imagine themselves as part of the same collective. As older religious and dynastic legitimacies declined, nationalism became the cultural medium enabling nations to be imagined into existence. In short, nationalism comes before nations, giving them shape and emotional depth. Now let's turn to Partha Chatterjee's critique in The Nation and its Fragments, where he re-evaluates the notion of nationalism from the perspective of the colonized regions. In the first chapter titled, Whose Imagined Community? Chatterjee accepts Anderson's insight that nations are imagined but rejects the idea that Asian or African nationalism was simply copied from European modular forms. His argument rests heavily on the fact that if colonized nations had only imitated Europe, there would have been nothing original to imagine, making them colonized forever. Therefore, he shows that nationalism in colonial societies was both political and cultural, and had its own sovereign domain even under colonial rule. This is where his famous distinction comes in, that is the two domains, inner, spiritual, and outer, material. To begin, the inner domain consists of culture, religion, family, and identity, where colonial authority was kept out. Nevertheless, this was not about preserving tradition, given nationalists actively reformed and modernized culture in their own ways, which were not completely westernized. For example, in Bengal, nationalists modernized the Bengali language through printing presses, newspapers, and literary societies. They developed urban theater, expanded education, reformed social customs, and promoted women's education, creating a modern cultural sphere rooted in their own history, not a copy of Europe. On the other hand, the outer domain is based on economy, statecraft, science, administration, bureaucratic and technological aspects where Western superiority was acknowledged. Here, the colonized elites adopted modern systems, but at the same time fought to remove colonial inequalities, such as Indians demanding equality in the civil service, in law, and in the press, insisting there should be no racial distinctions in governance. Here they fought on European liberal terms, but always with the prior sovereignty of their cultural inner domain in mind. By protecting the inner domain of culture while opposing the outer domain of politics, nationalism in the colonies became both a cultural and political struggle. Moving on to Chapter 2 of The Colonial State, where Chatterjee extends his argument by showing that colonial rule was built on the rule of colonial difference. This notion basically claims that modern principles like equality, rights, and rule of law were properly applied in Europe, but not in the colonies, contradicting the whole idea of Western liberal democracy. Chatterjee claims that this took place because the British claimed Indians were unfit for self-rule due to their belief in caste and religion, and they utilized this logic to justify their paternalistic and authoritarian rule, including harsher criminal laws for Indians as compared to the Westerners, censorship of Indian newspapers under the guise of emergency regulations. With this, Chatterjee argues that modern states still carry traces of this logic, the idea of exception, where rights can be suspended in times of crisis. In this way, colonial governance shaped modern power itself. So, how do Anderson and Chatterjee compare? First of all, Anderson explains how nations are felt as imagined communities through shared symbols, stories, and print culture. His framework captures the emotional pull of nationalism, whereas Chatterjee shows how, in colonized societies, nationalism was not just a copy of Europe, rather it was a creative act, which defended and reshaped cultural life in the inner domain, while borrowing useful modern tools in the outer domain. His framework explains anti-colonial nationalism more convincingly. Let's look at a few examples to see how these theories work. In Bengal, during the Renaissance, figures like Rabindranath Tagore and Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay modernized sectors of education, literature, and theater using print and modern schools. But their goal was to strengthen Bengali identity, not to imitate Europe, reflecting Chatterjee's inner domain. Later, the event of the Bangladesh language movement in 1952 gives us another striking perspective with the firm resistance of Bengalis when Pakistan attempted to impose Urdu as their language. Students in Dhaka protested, and many were killed on February 21st, turning their sacrifices into a symbol of cultural sovereignty, solidifying an imagined community rooted in language long before political independence in 1971. This aligns directly with Chatterjee's point that nationalism first secures a cultural sphere before it moves into formal politics. Nonetheless, Anderson's model doesn't fully explain such cases. For him, nationalism spread as a modular form from Europe, shaped mainly by print capitalism, but examples like Bengali and Palestinian nationalism show something different, where nationalism's foundation lies in the struggles of resistance, memory, and culture, not borrowed blueprints. For instance, Palestinians today remain dispersed across Gaza, the West Bank, refugee camps, and exile. Most will never meet, but they imagine themselves as one nation through cultural memory, shared traditions, and symbols like the flag and the key of return. This is not a borrowed European module. It is a locally produced imagination of freedom. Chatterjee also shows how nationalism in the colonial world was culturally sovereign, locally produced, and historically specific, for which his argument remains more convincing, while Anderson's concept of imagined communities helps us see how nations are felt. To sum up, Anderson explains how nations are imagined, and Chatterjee explains what is imagined in the colonial world and why. Together they enrich our understanding, but Chatterjee gives us the clearer, more accurate picture of nationalism in colonized societies, explaining why anti-colonial nationalism was not derivative but a creative project that designed a modern national culture distinct from Europe, while still resisting colonial rule.